The fog came every morning to Bletchley Park like clockwork, rolling across the Buckinghamshire countryside with the same methodical precision that governed everything else within those Victorian walls. It was November 1941, and the mist carried with it the smell of wet earth, coal smoke, and something else, something metallic and urgent that seemed to seep from the very ground itself. Inside the mansion and its sprawling network of hastily constructed huts, Britain's brightest minds worked in absolute secrecy, racing against time to break the Nazi Enigma codes. But outside, in the pre-dawn darkness, there was only silence, routine, and a man with a mop. His name was Albert Thornton, and nobody noticed him. At 53 years old, Albert had the kind of face that disappeared in crowds, weathered, unremarkable, with tired eyes that had seen too many winters and not enough hope. He'd been a custodian at Bletchley Park since 1939, transferred from his previous posting at a government building in London after his lungs had been damaged in a factory fire years before. The work was simple: sweep the floors, empty the bins, keep the blackout curtains properly drawn, ensure the stoves were stocked with coal. He asked no questions. He read no papers left carelessly on desks. He existed in the margins of history, invisible to the codebreakers and military officers who rushed past him with their leather briefcases and furrowed brows. But Albert noticed things. It was a habit born from a lifetime of being overlooked. When people don't see you, you learn to see everything. He noticed, for instance, that Commander Denniston always arrived at precisely 06:45 hours, except on Tuesdays, when he came 15 minutes earlier. He noticed that the young mathematician from Cambridge, the one with the nervous stutter, only ate sandwiches when the decryption work was going badly. He noticed which lights stayed on through the night in Hut 6, and which personnel looked increasingly hollow-eyed as the autumn wore on. He noticed the rhythms of Bletchley Park, the way a musician notices the tempo of a symphony, and he knew, instinctively, when something was off. The first irregularity occurred on a Tuesday evening in early November. Albert was making his rounds through the grounds at dusk, his footsteps crunching on the gravel paths between the huts. The evening shift was changing, young women from the WRNS hurrying toward their posts, while day workers trudged toward the barracks, their faces gray with exhaustion. The war had been grinding on for over 2 years now, and everyone at Bletchley carried the weight of it differently, some in the slope of their shoulders, others in the mechanical way they lit their cigarettes, hands shaking just slightly in the cold. That's when Albert saw the man. He was standing at the edge of the property, just beyond the fence line, partially obscured by a cluster of bare oak trees. At first glance, he might have been a local farmer or a walker who'd lost his way, but Albert's instincts, honed by decades of quiet observation, told him otherwise. The man's posture was wrong, too still, too focused. His head was tilted upward, not at the sky, but at the mansion itself, studying it with an intensity that made Albert's breath catch in his chest. Albert continued walking, careful not to alter his pace or direction. He'd learned long ago that the best way to observe was to appear utterly disinterested. He stopped to adjust his cap, using the moment to glance back. The man was still there, and now Albert could see more details. A dark coat, well made, too expensive for a farmhand, shoes that reflected what little light remained in the dusk, and something in his hand. Binoculars? A camera? The man turned suddenly, as if sensing Albert's attention, and for a brief moment their eyes met across the distance. Then he was gone, melting into the tree line with a speed that confirmed every one of Albert's suspicions. Albert's heart hammered against his ribs. His first instinct was to report it immediately, run to the security office, raise the alarm. But he hesitated. What would he say? That he'd seen a man standing near the property? That he had a feeling something was wrong? He was a custodian. Nobody listened to custodians. They'd probably assume he'd been drinking or that his damaged lungs were affecting his judgment. He'd be dismissed, patronized, sent back to his mop and bucket. So instead, Albert decided to watch, and to remember. Over the next 3 days, he saw the man twice more, always at dusk, always studying the buildings from different vantage points outside the perimeter. On the third sighting, Albert noticed something else. The man was particularly interested in Hut 6 and Hut 8, the 2 buildings where the most critical Enigma work was being conducted. He seemed to be mapping them, measuring distances, calculating angles. Albert began keeping notes in a small journal he kept in his coat pocket. Times, locations, descriptions. He told himself it was probably nothing, that he was being paranoid, that the war had made everyone see shadows where there were none. But the knot in his stomach wouldn't loosen. On November 14th, everything changed. Albert was cleaning the administrative offices in the mansion's east wing when he overheard two RAF officers talking in low, urgent voices. They didn't see him. They never did, hunched over his bucket in the corner, wringing out his mop. Their conversation drifted over him like smoke. "Intelligence suggests the Luftwaffe is planning something significant," one said, his voice tight with worry. "They've been conducting reconnaissance flights over strategic sites across the Midlands. If they discover what we're doing here—" "They won't," the other officer interrupted, but there was no conviction in his tone. "We're too well hidden. Just another country estate as far as they're concerned." "Are we? Because someone's been asking questions in the village. A stranger. German accent, poorly disguised as Dutch." Albert's hand stilled on the mop handle. His mind raced back to the man by the fence. The expensive coat, the careful observation, the calculated movements. Not a spy gathering information for a future ground assault. A spotter, identifying targets for a bombing raid. And suddenly, with the clarity of absolute certainty, Albert understood. The man had been measuring approach angles for aircraft, identifying the most valuable buildings, marking them for destruction. Bletchley Park, the nerve center of Britain's war effort, the place where battles were won before they were even fought, was about to be bombed, and nobody knew except a 53-year-old custodian with bad lungs and a mop. The question was, would anyone believe him? Albert Thornton had never considered himself a brave man. Bravery, in his experience, belonged to soldiers storming beaches and pilots dogfighting in burning skies, not to custodians who smelled of floor wax and lived in single rooms with peeling wallpaper. But standing in that administrative office, mop in hand, and revelation burning in his chest, Albert discovered that courage sometimes wore the most ordinary face imaginable. The two RAF officers had left, their conversation dissolving into the maze of corridors that honeycombed Bletchley's Victorian mansion. Albert remained frozen, his reflection staring back at him from the polished floor he'd just cleaned. A small, tired man in a worn uniform, holding evidence that might save thousands of lives or mark him as a paranoid fool. He made his decision in the span of a heartbeat. 20 minutes later, Albert found himself standing outside Commander Alistair Deniston's office, his journal clutched in trembling hands. The commander's secretary, a severe woman named Miss Hartley, who guarded access to Deniston with the ferocity of a Spitfire defending London, looked up from her typewriter with barely concealed irritation. "The commander doesn't see maintenance staff without an appointment," she said, her fingers never pausing on the keys. "If there's a facilities issue, submit a request through proper channels." "It's not about facilities, miss." Albert's voice came out rougher than intended, his damaged lungs making the words sound like gravel shifting. "It's about security. There's something he needs to know." Miss Hartley's fingers stopped. She looked at him properly for the first time, and Albert saw the calculation happening behind her eyes. The weighing of protocol against intuition, bureaucracy against the possibility of genuine threat. The war had taught everyone at Bletchley to trust their instincts, even when those instincts came from unexpected sources. "Wait here," she said finally, and disappeared through the heavy oak door. The wait felt eternal. Albert could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the journal growing damp from the sweat on his palms. Through the window, dusk was settling over the grounds again, the hour when the stranger always appeared. What if he was out there now, finalizing his reconnaissance? What if this was the last evening before the Luftwaffe came screaming out of the night sky? The door opened. Miss Hartley gestured him inside. Commander Deniston sat behind a desk buried in papers, maps, and decryption logs. He was a compact man in his early 50s, with sharp eyes magnified by wire-rimmed spectacles and the permanent furrow of someone who carried the weight of Britain's survival on his shoulders. He did not invite Albert to sit. "Miss Hartley says you have security concerns." Deniston's tone was neutral, but not unkind. "You're Thornton, yes? Custodial staff since '39? "Yes, sir." Albert straightened his spine, trying to look like someone whose words mattered. "I've seen something. Someone. Outside the perimeter, watching the huts, multiple times over the past week." He placed the journal on Deniston's desk, his hand shaking slightly. The commander opened it, his eyes scanning Albert's careful notes, Dates, times, locations, descriptions written in cramped but meticulous handwriting. November 11th, 1843 hours. Man observing from northeast tree line. Deniston read aloud. November 12th, 1915 hours. Same individual, southwest position near the lake. He looked up. You're certain it was the same man? Yes, sir. Same coat, same build, same way of moving. He wasn't casual about it. He was studying the buildings, especially huts 6 and 8, measuring them, I think, like he was... Albert hesitated, knowing how the next words would sound. Like he was marking targets, sir. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Deniston removed his spectacles, cleaning them with a handkerchief, while his mind worked through implications and probabilities. Albert had seen that same expression on the codebreakers' faces when they were close to cracking a particularly stubborn Enigma message, the look of someone assembling scattered pieces into a coherent, terrible pattern. I overheard 2 RAF officers this afternoon, Albert continued, his voice gaining strength. They mentioned reconnaissance flights over the Midlands. A stranger in the village with a German accent. Sir, if someone's been identifying our buildings from the ground, and the Luftwaffe has been flying reconnaissance missions. Deniston held up a hand, silencing him. He reached for his telephone, dialed 3 numbers. Get me Wing Commander Travers, immediately. The next 30 minutes unfolded with the controlled urgency of a military operation. Travers arrived within minutes, a lean RAF officer with a fighter pilot's quick movements and calculating eyes. He listened to Albert's account, examined the journal, asked sharp, specific questions about the stranger's behavior and positioning. More officers appeared. Maps were spread across Deniston's desk. Telephone calls were made to RAF stations and security divisions. Albert stood against the wall, forgotten once again, watching the machinery of British intelligence transform his simple observations into actionable intelligence. He felt simultaneously vindicated and terrified. Vindicated that they were taking him seriously, terrified that his suspicions might actually be correct. If Thornton's assessment is accurate, Travers said, tracing flight paths on a map with his finger, and this individual was conducting ground reconnaissance for a bombing raid, we're looking at a strike within the next 48 to 72 hours. They'd want to hit us while the intelligence is fresh, before we have time to reinforce or relocate operations. Can we increase anti-aircraft defenses without drawing attention? Deniston asked. Not enough to matter. Bletchley isn't equipped for a sustained aerial assault. We were never supposed to be discovered. Travers looked up, his face grim. If they come, and if they've identified our critical huts, we're looking at potentially catastrophic damage to the cryptanalysis operations. Everything we've built here, everything we've accomplished, gone in one night. The words hung in the air like smoke from a crashed bomber. Albert thought about the young people working in those huts, the mathematicians and linguists and WRNS operators who barely slept, who sacrificed everything to break codes that saved convoy ships and prevented U-boat ambushes. He thought about the intelligence that flowed from this place, invisible but vital, the difference between victory and defeat playing out in encrypted German transmissions. And he thought about the stranger by the fence, methodically marking them all for death. There's another option, Deniston said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of a decision already made. We evacuate the most critical personnel and equipment tonight, quietly. No official alarm, no panic. Just disappear the things that matter most. If they bomb empty buildings, we lose brick and mortar but keep our people and our work intact. And if Thornton is wrong? Someone asked. If this is just a paranoid custodian seeing ghosts? All eyes turned to Albert. He felt the weight of their scrutiny, felt the decades of invisibility suddenly stripped away, leaving him exposed under the harsh light of consequence. One man's observations, untrained and unofficial, about to dictate the movement of Britain's most valuable intelligence assets. Deniston looked at Albert for a long moment, and in that look was a question that went beyond words. Do you believe what you saw? Albert met his gaze steadily. I believe it, sir. I believe he was marking us for bombing, and I believe if we do nothing, good people are going to die. Deniston nodded once, decisively. Then we evacuate, tonight. Travers, coordinate with... The air raid siren cut through the night like a knife through silk, its wailing scream turning every face in the room to stone. They were already here. The siren's wail tore through Bletchley Park like the scream of something dying. For a single frozen heartbeat, everyone in Deniston's office remained motionless. Officers, commanders, and one custodian who had just gambled everything on his observations. Then the world exploded into controlled chaos. "All personnel to shelters, now!" Travers was already moving, his RAF training overriding everything else. Through the window, Albert could see figures running across the grounds, silhouettes against the dimming sky, racing toward the reinforced shelters that suddenly seemed pitifully inadequate for what was coming. But Deniston wasn't moving toward the shelters. He was grabbing folders from his desk, shoving them into a leather case with hands that moved with practiced efficiency despite the trembling in his fingers. "Travers, get the Enigma machines from Hut 8. Prioritize the naval settings. We can't lose those, not with the Atlantic convoys depending on them." "Sir, there's no time." "Make time!" Deniston's voice cracked like a whip. "Thornton was right. They found us, which means every second we have before those bombs fall is a second we use to save what matters." Albert found himself moving without conscious thought, his custodian's knowledge of every corridor and shortcut suddenly the most valuable intelligence in the room. "The back service entrance to Hut 6 is fastest," he said, his damaged lungs making the words come in gasps. "I can get us there in 90 seconds if we go through the kitchen." Nobody questioned him. In that moment, the invisible man had become the guide, and they followed. The grounds of Bletchley Park had transformed into a nightmare of running shadows and shouted orders. The November night pressed down like a physical weight, and somewhere in the darkness above, Albert could hear it, the distant, growing drone of aircraft engines. Heinkel He 111 bombers, if he remembered the recognition charts correctly from his brief training. The sound was like approaching thunder, mechanical and merciless. They ran. Albert led the way, his shorter legs pumping harder than they had in decades, his scarred lungs screaming protest. Behind him came Deniston and Travers, followed by other officers whose names Albert didn't know, but whose importance he understood. They burst into Hut 6, where codebreakers looked up in confusion and fear from their stations. "Grab the critical documents only," Travers shouted. "Prioritize anything related to German Army and Air Force codes." "Move!" The scene repeated in Hut 8. Mathematicians scrambling to gather papers, women from the WRNS carefully lifting the precious Enigma machines from their desks, treating them like wounded children being evacuated from London. Albert helped where he could, his custodian's strength surprisingly useful for carrying equipment that weighed more than it looked. The bomber engines were louder now, close. The anti-aircraft guns at nearby RAF stations had opened up, their distant thumping like an irregular heartbeat. Searchlights stabbed the sky, illuminating clouds, but finding nothing. The Heinkels were flying high, beyond easy interception, guided by reconnaissance photos and ground intelligence that had been painstakingly gathered by men like the one Albert had seen by the fence. 30 seconds! Someone screamed. "Get to the shelters!" They ran again, this time weighted down with the intellectual treasures of Bletchley Park, machines and documents, and mathematical breakthrough that represented thousands of hours of brilliant minds working in secrecy. Albert helped a young WRN's officer carry an Enigma machine, the wooden box slipping in his sweating hands, his vision narrowing to just the path ahead, and the shelter entrance growing larger with each desperate step. Then the night split open. The first bomb fell on the northwestern edge of the property, near the motor pool. Even from 100 yards away, the explosion was a physical thing, a wall of pressure and sound that hit like a fist, knocking Albert and the WRNS officer to their knees. The Enigma machine crashed to the ground between them. Around them, the world had become fire and concussion, the Victorian mansion's windows blowing out in glittering cascades, the carefully maintained grounds erupting in fountains of earth and flame. "Leave it!" the officer screamed at him, already running. But Albert couldn't. His hands found the wooden case in the darkness, his muscles straining to lift it even as his instincts screamed at him to abandon it and run. This machine had broken codes that saved ships. That saved lives. He couldn't leave it in the dirt to be destroyed. The second bomb fell closer, the third closer still. Albert ran with the Enigma machine clutched against his chest, ran while the earth heaved beneath him and the sky rained fire, ran while Hut 4 took a direct hit and exploded in a column of flame that turned night into day. He could see the shelter entrance ahead, could see hands reaching out to pull people inside, could hear voices screaming his name, When had anyone ever known his name? The fourth bomb fell directly on Hut 6. The building where Albert had spent countless hours mopping floors and emptying bins simply ceased to exist, replaced by an expanding sphere of destruction that consumed everything within 20 yards. The blast wave caught Albert from behind, lifting him off his feet and hurling him forward like a rag doll. He flew, he tumbled, he crashed into something hard and unforgiving, the Enigma machine flying from his arms, his body folding around the impact. Then there were hands pulling him into darkness, voices shouting, the iron taste of blood in his mouth. The shelter door slammed shut with a boom that was almost gentle compared to the chaos outside. Someone was coughing. Someone was crying. Someone was checking him for injuries with quick, professional hands. "He saved it," a voice said. "The Custodian saved the machine." The bombing raid lasted 17 minutes. 17 minutes of sustained assault that felt like hours. The shelter shaking with each impact. Dust raining from the ceiling. People huddled together in the darkness, praying to whatever gods they still believed in. Albert sat with his back against the cold wall, his ribs screaming where he'd hit the ground, his hands still trembling with adrenaline and terror. But he was alive. They were alive. When the all-clear finally sounded, and they emerged into the smoking ruins of Bletchley Park, Albert saw what his simple observations had accomplished. Hut 6 was gone. Hut 4 was burning. The motor pool had been obliterated. But Hut 8, where the naval Enigma work was done, stood intact. The mansion, though damaged, still stood. And more importantly, the people, the machines, the documents that mattered most had been saved because someone had listened to a custodian with a mop. Commander Deniston found Albert standing in the rubble, staring at the destruction with the blank expression of someone processing trauma. The commander's uniform was covered in dust, his glasses cracked, but his eyes were clear. "Thornton," he said quietly. "If you hadn't reported what you saw, if we hadn't started evacuating the critical materials when we did—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Albert nodded slowly. "I just sweep floors, sir." "No," Deniston replied, and there was something profound in his voice. "You saved Bletchley Park. You saved the war effort. You're a bloody hero, even if we can never tell anyone." That was the paradox, Albert realized. He had performed perhaps the most important act of his life, had saved countless lives and preserved the intelligence apparatus that would help win the war, and it would never be acknowledged. It would remain classified, buried in files that wouldn't be opened for decades. He would go back to being invisible, to pushing his mop and emptying his bins, while the world never knew what the Custodian had done. But as dawn broke over the wounded grounds of Bletchley Park, as survivors emerged to begin rebuilding, as the codebreakers returned to their work with renewed determination, Albert Thornton understood something fundamental. Heroism didn't require recognition. Courage didn't need medals. Sometimes saving the world looked exactly like an ordinary man, paying attention when no one else did, and having the bravery to speak up when every instinct told him he didn't matter. The fog rolled in again that morning, just like always, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and smoke, and the promise of another day's work. Albert picked up his mop. There was glass to sweep up, after all, and someone needed to do it. In the margins of history, where custodians live and heroes are born, Albert Thornton went back to being invisible. But Bletchley Park survived. The codes continued to be broken, and the war, slowly, began to turn. All because one man noticed what others missed. Trailendi,